A manuscript was found in 2022 that, if taken even partially at face value, forces us to look at a single year the way one studies the eye of a storm. Alleged text speaks in a blunt, almost impatient voice. It repeats a date, lays out scenarios in plain terms, and returns again and again to a single question: what will we do when the calm itself becomes the trap? Consider this, a voice from centuries past, resurfacing amid dust and rotted bindings, and pointing a finger not at kings or wars, but at a threshold that lands squarely on our calendar. That is the claim. That is the shock the headline promises. According to those who first brought the pages to light, the manuscript emerged from a forgotten cluster of documents tucked away in a regional archive in southern France. The description given by the initial team feels cinematic. A leather-bound folio, pages browned at the edges, ink smears where hands once rushed, and marginal notes in a cramped hand. Roman numerals appear in the corners of some leaves, a few dates scrawled repeatedly in the margins, and, most striking, a line-like motif that translators and paleographers say reads like an insistence rather than ornamentation. Some experts describe the handwriting as anachronistic in style. Others say it fits certain late Renaissance practices. The debates about provenance are ongoing and must remain part of how we treat every claim that follows. This text is, by all accounts, unusually direct. Where Nostradamus's quatrains often folded warning into allegory, this manuscript reportedly uses language that reads like a wake-up call. It speaks not of singular cataclysms so much of cumulative failures, systems that empty out from the inside, leaders who arrive bearing applause and leave freedoms hollowed, and natural forces that trigger one another in a chain reaction. Most unsettling to many readers is its repeated emphasis on the year 2026. The manuscript does not, according to translations circulating among scholars and journalists, give precise coordinates or the names of cities that will suffer. Instead, it treats the year as a hinge, a time when choices will tighten and when certain patterns, left unchecked, could cascade into broader collapse. Before we go deeper, a brief note. This story is built from claims, translations, and interpretations. The manuscript is described as an alleged discovery. Some scholars urge caution. Others find the tone and content provocative enough to investigate further. What follows is an unpacking of what the document reportedly asserts, how it connects to patterns we can see today, and what the human consequences might look like if those patterns accelerate.
If this topic grabs you and you want to stay informed as more findings emerge, take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps this channel follow developments and bring perspectives from both skeptics and experts. When scholars first spread images of the pages, two things captured attention: the material evidence and the way the text names modes of deception rather than specific enemies. The parchment shows ink that bled in places, as if the writer made particular marks in haste or passion. There are tears along the binding, like seams that almost failed, and small, deliberate strokes that some paleographers read as numbering devices, recurring Roman numerals, sequences that might indicate chapters or stages. Those numerals often cluster near sections where the translator's notes render the prose as describing thresholds or gates. Where typical Nostradamus quatrains leave readers squinting for pattern, this alleged manuscript loops phrases that modern interpreters render as motifs: a calm that conceals, a light that blinds, and repeatedly the year itself, 2026, written with a kind of insistence that feels deliberate rather than decorative. Experts who have seen early images caution against equating aesthetic detail with certainty. Handwriting can be deceptive, ink can be remounted or altered. But even among cautious scholars, there is curiosity about the manuscript's thematic focus. If authenticated, its tone would mark a notable departure for any prophetic voice tied to the 16th century. It reads less like foretelling single events and more like diagnosing long, systemic vulnerabilities. In the hands of translators, pages that describe the calm that betrays are being read as warnings about a peace so perfect that it prevents scrutiny. Lines about the man who walks in light yet leaves no shadow are being discussed as symbolic portraits of influence without accountability. Again, these are readings, not certainties, but they are readings that resonate precisely because they mirror anxieties we already live with. Let's unpack the manuscript's central warnings as they have been presented so far, bearing in mind the need for caution and the importance of context. The text speaks in broad categories: deception, silent collapse, environmental cascades, and spiritual confusion. Each category is framed as a slow-motion problem rather than a single dramatic disaster, a rusting of foundations rather than an explosive collapse. To understand how these categories might play out, consider how the manuscript's language corresponds to phenomena visible in our world today. Deception, according to the manuscript as translated by some commentators, is not a crude fraud, it is a sophistication of influence. The document describes mechanisms that amplify certainty while muffling nuance, channels that make rumor sound like consensus, technologies that refine persuasion into habit, public rhythms that reward spectacle and penalize dissent.
In modern terms, this looks eerily familiar. Information technologies can create feedback loops. Algorithms prioritize engagement over accuracy. Narratives that confirm belief systems get shared and hardened. The alleged manuscript warns that these mechanisms can be weaponized, not with blunt force, but with the softer tools of trust and convenience. A leader need not storm a capital if institutions themselves bow, quietly, to the gravity of popularity and the demand for unity. The phrase some translators render as "the lock that closes when men applaud" is a sobering image. Applause does not always equal consent, and consent does not always equal freedom. Closely linked is the theme of silent institutional collapse. The manuscript does not depict institutions falling with a single dramatic act. Instead, it describes infrastructures that appear intact while erosion occurs beneath the surface. Think of financial networks that grow complex and brittle, supply lines that rely on just-in-time precision, regulatory frameworks that are hollowed by credulous trust. When a system becomes opaque, small failures compound. The alleged text speaks of pillars unseen giving way, of systems that continue to function by habit until a small variable upsets the balance. This is not prophecy in the doom and gloom sense. It is a diagnosis of systemic risk presented through prophetic language. Some experts reading the pages see an echo of modern concerns: economic fragility, cyber dependence, administrative complacency. The manuscript's voice seems to suggest that the danger lies not in an obvious assault, but in the slow acceptance of shortcuts and the normalization of reduced scrutiny. Then there is the environmental threat. The manuscript reportedly frames nature's role not as singular catastrophe, but as a chain reaction, one strain leading to another, a tumult of events whose combination amplifies harm. Instead of predicting a single isolated disaster, it speaks of anomalies tipping into one another, storms that erode infrastructure, then fires that consume weakened defenses, then quakes and floods rearranging already fragile supply lines. To be clear, the document does not offer a scientific model. It offers a poetic framing that can be read as a metaphor for climate instability or as a literal warning. Some scholars and analysts have suggested reading these passages alongside contemporary climate science. The idea that destabilized systems can produce cascading failures is a pattern scientists recognize in complex ecological and infrastructural systems. Where the manuscript uses evocative imagery to describe cascading environmental strain, modern models use data to describe feedback loops. The juxtaposition matters. One is a voice of warning couched in metaphor. The other is a body of evidence that shows how interdependent systems can fail in sequence. How might these warnings play out in daily life?
The manuscript, again according to translators, lingers on human consequences: erosion of trust, fractured families, communities that turn inward. Imagine a neighborhood where the local paper goes silent, replaced by curated feeds that confirm each resident's view. Imagine governance that moves faster than oversight, led by figures who are celebrated on screens and whose policies are accepted before they are understood. Imagine ecosystems stressed until food and shelter become more precarious in some regions. The manuscript paints scenes of people standing on their porches, clouded by confusion, unable to know whether to trust the mayor, the preacher, the feed, or the friend next door. It is not a catalog of particular tragedies. It is a psychological and social portrait of slow disintegration. Those who take the manuscript seriously also point to the figure it portrays as central to the unfolding pattern, the one who walks in the light but casts no shadow. This is not, the translators emphasize, meant to be a literal miracle worker or a theatrical villain. The image functions as a symbol of a leader who commands applause, who dazzles with solutions and promises, but who leaves behind an absence of accountability. The text suggests that such a person will win trust through performance and through offering the illusion of peace. Crowds might mistake appearance for substance. The danger, as the manuscript frames it, is that the seduction of certainty can numb critical thinking. When institutions defer to the spectacle, oversight wanes, and liberties erode in increments that look at the moment like progress. This is where spiritual confusion enters the narrative. The manuscript, in the portions translated, draws links between moral clarity and community resilience. It does so without clerical prescriptions. The rhetorical move is pastoral rather than polemical. Some phrases read like counsel. Keep the lamp trimmed, the manuscript seems to say. Do not let the flame be replaced by a mirrored light. Translators and some theologians who have engaged the text note parallels with familiar religious themes: tests of faith, seduction by false teachers, the refinement of the faithful through trial, but they stress these are parallels, not identifications. The document's voice appears to warn that spiritual communities can be co-opted when they prioritize comfort over truth, unity over discernment. The risk is not only doctrinal error, but ethical compromise. When spiritual leaders echo the moods of the crowd rather than the demand of conscience, believers themselves may be drawn into choices they will later regret. Readers should notice an important restraint in these readings. The manuscript, as reported, does not predict a single scripted apocalypse. It frames moments as choices and thresholds. That is why 2026 reads like a hinge.
The date is not declared as the day the sky falls. It is presented as a year in which multiple trends could tighten and reveal whether societies will act with foresight or drift into complacency. Some interpreters emphasize that this reading assumes agency. It assumes that a remnant of people can still resist by practicing truth and restraint. Others are more deterministic, arguing that certain systemic forces, once set in motion, will be difficult to stop. The debate is part of how we should treat the manuscript, as a stimulus for conversation, not as an ultimatum. Amid these warnings, the text also sketches a counter-narrative. Interwoven in the darker pages are descriptions of what the manuscript calls the silent watchers, not vigilantes in the criminal sense, but custodians of knowledge and conscience. These are ordinary people who refuse easy answers, librarians who keep physical records, communities that meet face-to-face to exchange news verified by more than a feed, small groups who steward local resources and preserve traditions of accountability. The manuscript praises these quiet acts as seeds of renewal. In the alleged text depiction, heroes are not those with grand armies, but those who guard truth in small, unglamorous ways. The imagery is striking. While great crowds are dazzled by a light that casts no shadow, a few keep the lamps lit in corners. These are the ones who, the manuscript implies, will matter when choices harden. It is important to emphasize the manuscript's repeated moral register. It frames much of the problem in terms of choice rather than inevitability. Where some apocalyptic narratives remove agency and cast future outcomes as fated, the alleged Nostradamus pages appear to call for moral discernment. The voice is at once urgent and admonitory. It asks, in effect, will you sacrifice scrutiny for comfort? Will you accept a polished peace at the price of freedoms you barely notice slipping away? These are questions, not prophecies written in stone. They are ethical prompts embedded within a rhetoric of warning. Yet even as the document offers counsel, it raises more practical puzzles. If the dangers are systemic and subtle, how does one respond? The manuscript does not provide a checklist. Its prescriptions are moral and communal. Maintain transparency, preserve records, elevate truth over spectacle. That lack of specificity has drawn criticism. Skeptics point out that moral exhortation, while noble, offers little against the technical realities of cyber threats, climate shocks, or financial contagion. Proponents counter that moral clarity is a prerequisite for technical response. A society that values truth is likelier to invest in robust oversight and resilient systems. The debate between moral and technical responses is not new, but the manuscript's alleged emphasis on moral stamina has reignited it.
As the debate has unfolded, a quiet conversation has also emerged in religious and secular communities alike. On one side are those who read the manuscript through a symbolic lens, seeing in it a call to vigilance rather than prophecy. On the other are readers who feel the text's specificity about 2026 demand sober preparation, ethical reflection, and communal discussion. Neither position by itself supplies a definitive map forward, but together they force a public reckoning. How will communities balance comfort and scrutiny, convenience and oversight, spectacle and substance? Beyond the debates, the human stories that people attach to these pages are what give the manuscript its gravity. Among the translators and archivists who handled the folio, accounts circulate of late nights spent comparing marginalia, of family archivists who recognized handwriting passed down in small private letters, and of communities that suddenly found themselves reconsidering what counts as trustworthy record-keeping. People have told stories of neighbors who once trusted a single news source now cross-checking facts at kitchen tables, of faith leaders who publicly wrestle with the difference between leadership that comforts and leadership that misleads, of parents teaching children to ask not just what a story says, but who benefits if everyone believes it. These are not dramatic episodes, but they are the kind of slow, human shifts that the manuscript seems primarily concerned with documenting. If the alleged manuscript is right to focus on quiet shifts rather than loud ruptures, then the question becomes one of perception. What does it take for a society to notice a pattern before it becomes irreversible? The manuscript's repeated motif of the mirror, a device that shows you yourself but also reveals what you refuse to see, captures this problem. The mirror shock, as some commentators call it, is the moment when illusions fall away and people see the architecture of their compliance. It might look like a sudden loss of access to a trusted platform, a scandal that reveals systemic distortion, or a natural event that exposes brittle infrastructure. The manuscript's language teases towards such a moment without delivering a precise script. That rhetorical choice matters. It invites readers to reflect on what kind of mirror would break through their own complacency. As we approach the midpoint of this unfolding exploration, a tension begins to sharpen. The manuscript paints both a danger and a remedy, but it leaves precise outcomes ambiguous. This ambiguity is perhaps intentional. Prophetic voice in this text acts as both alarm and moral interrogator. The more we study the language, the more it nudges us towards self-examination. Who are the figures we would trust unquestioningly? What comforts might we trade away in the name of convenience? How do we measure the health of our institutions beyond their appearance of normal operation?
At the same time, the practical question hangs heavy. Why 2026? Some scholars who have examined the images of the manuscript suggest that the date functions as a rhetorical device, a proximate point that compresses time and forces urgency. Others speculate that certain structural thresholds in modern systems could plausibly align around that year, though they caution against any deterministic reading. Still others point out that a concrete date sharpens attention in ways a vague warning cannot. Whether 2026 is literal or symbolic, the effect is the same. It turns a general anxiety into a near-term demand for moral and civic attention. There is also the matter of scale. The manuscript speaks in both global and local registers. It addresses the broad sweep of systems and the intimate circle of family and faith. That dual focus is what gives it rhetorical power. It does not confine its warnings to headlines, nor does it limit them to private conscience. Instead, it insists that the two are connected. A community that loses its capacity to distinguish spectacle from substance will over time shape political economies and technological standards in ways that deepen fragility. Conversely, local acts of care, preserving records, practicing discernment, modeling accountability, can in aggregate strengthen the resilience of broader systems. The alleged manuscript frames this as a moral ecology. Small ethical practices influence collective outcomes. Not everyone is persuaded by the manuscript's framing. Critics argue that treating a dubious folio as a template for public anxiety diverts attention from verifiable problems. They caution against the seductive clarity of prophetic language that simplifies complex technical issues into moral narratives. These critics are right to demand evidence and to remind us that complex systems require technical, evidence-based responses. But even they acknowledge a pragmatic truth. Narratives shape how societies allocate attention and resources. What we choose to talk about, what we choose to warn against, changes what we watch for. So what does a sober, cautious reader do with this alleged manuscript in hand? One useful starting point is to separate three questions that the document blends: authenticity, interpretation, and implication. Authenticity concerns whether the folio is genuinely from the period it claims to be, and whether its markings were altered. Interpretation concerns how we read its metaphors, and whether those readings apply to contemporary phenomena. Implication concerns the actions and conversations we might pursue if we accept, even provisionally, that the manuscript captures an important pattern of risk and moral challenge.
Scholars and analysts differ on each front, and that multiplicity of perspectives is precisely what should temper both alarm and dismissal. Meanwhile, the manuscript's narrative continues to echo through communities.
Online, it has become a lightning rod for debate between those who see in it chilling precision and those who see useful metaphor. In faith communities, the pages are prompting sermons and study groups that do not leap to doomsday predictions, but instead focus on discernment, stewardship, and community resilience. Among technologists and system thinkers, the text has prompted a surprising number of conversations about the ethics of design. What are the incentives that allow persuasion to ossify into control? In neighborhoods, people have started discussing basic practices of verification, of keeping physical copies of essential documents, and of building redundancies that are small, local, and social rather than spectacular. And yet, for all the talk and for all the experts weighing in, a certain narrative hole remains. The manuscript intimates a climax, a moment of mirror shock and choice, but stops short of scripting precisely how the moral choice is to be made or enforced. That omission may be deliberate, for a text that commands moral attention has more power when it leaves space for readers to project themselves into the decision. The manuscript's rhetorical strategy is not to terrify, but to provoke. It wants the reader to ask, if the mirror breaks, what will I see? Will I see that I abdicated responsibility to comfort and spectacle? Will I see that promises were accepted without scrutiny? Such questions are uncomfortable because they implicate us individually and collectively. They also tie into another theme the manuscript raises obliquely, the role of humility. The text, in fragments that attract study, praises small acts of fidelity as more consequential than grand gestures. This is not the rhetorical flourish of a prophet who desires drama. It is an insistence that moral and social stability is built on habits that do not show up in headlines. The manuscript's gaze is paradoxically micro-focused. While it warns of global cascades and systemic collapse, it elevates the quiet guardianship of everyday truth-telling. As these layers accumulate, material evidence, thematic warnings, ethical prompts, and human stories, the pressure builds toward a point of recognition. The manuscript's insistence on 2026 becomes less about predicting an event and more about creating temporal urgency. If the next few years are to be a test of whether societies will choose scrutiny over convenience, transparency over spectacle, what will that test look like in practice? Will it be shaped by public policy and technical safeguards, or by a quieter shift in communal habits and moral expectations? We are left with the image the manuscript returns to again and again, a light that blinds and a lamp that preserves. Which will we tend? Which lights will we trust? The pages urge readers to imagine both the one who dazzles and the one who keeps the lamp trimmed.
They also press readers to ask whether applause can be a reliable measure of legitimacy, and whether a calm that persuades everyone to believe in itself might actually be the calm that betrays. At this point in the story, the questions multiply, and the stakes feel personal. The manuscript's alleged warnings about deception, silent collapse, environmental chain reactions, and spiritual confusion do not resolve themselves neatly into a plan of action. They form, instead, a mosaic of concerns that demand conversation across disciplines. Historians, paleographers, technologists, theologians, climate scientists, and ordinary citizens. If nothing else, the folio has succeeded in directing attention. It has made the question of 2026 not merely a calendar date, but a marker for public deliberation about priorities, oversight, and the habits that sustain a society. As we prepare to trace the manuscript's remaining contours, the deeper anatomy of the figure who walks in the light but casts no shadow, the fuller portrait of the silent watchers, and the precise nature of the mirror shock the text implies, it is worth pausing to consider the mood the pages cultivate. It is not panic, it is a stern invitation to vigilance, not fatalism, a call to exercise judgment. This framing distinguishes the alleged Nostradamus manuscript from lurid apocalyptic tracts. It asks readers to do the harder work of small, steady fidelity rather than the seductive drama of final acts. There is an inevitable question that hovers here. If these pages are in the end a clever forgery or a misattributed commentary, what then? Even in that scenario, their circulation would be instructive. A forged warning that galvanizes communities to safeguard records, to demand transparency, and to cultivate local resilience would have performed a civic good. Conversely, if the manuscript is authentic or contains a kernel of prescient insight, then the conversations we start now could be the difference between an avoidable moral erosion and a course correction. Either way, the ethical prompt remains. What do we owe one another in terms of truth, scrutiny, and the courage to question what comforts us? The folio's pages, as they are being read and debated, lean toward one final unsettling image in the sections that follow, an image that the manuscript reportedly repeats as a motif, the mirror that reveals what enthusiasm and convenience have concealed. It is an image that makes you ask about your own reflections. What will you see when the mirror comes? Will you see a face shaped by careful stewardship, or one softened by the comforts of unquestioned belief? That question is the hinge on which the subsequent chapters of the manuscript turn. It is also the hinge on which public life may turn in the coming months.
The next portion of the story, we will examine traces how the figure of the false savior operates across institutions, and how small acts of truth-tending can accumulate into societal resilience. But before we go there, pause and imagine the scene the manuscript sketches. A city lit by 1,000 screens, people applauding a promise, and somewhere in a dim room, a single figure keeping a lamp burning while others cheer. Who will history remember? Who will future communities think? The manuscript invites you to take a position now, not because it commands it as prophecy, but because it frames moral choice as timely and consequential. If this exploration is prompting you to think differently about the near future, about trust and institutions, about how technology shapes consent, and about the fragile interplay between environment and infrastructure, share your thoughts below and tell others who might need to reflect with us. The conversation matters. The way we talk about risk, responsibility, and faith shapes how we prepare and how we respond. And in the end, the alleged pages, whether genuine, partial, or symbolic, are only powerful to the extent that they spur us to ask hard questions and to act with prudence and courage. We will return to the manuscript's most unsettling symbol, the one who walks in the light but casts no shadow, and follow its implications through the corridors of power, the pews of worship, and the neighborhoods where daily truth is either defended or surrendered. For now, hold the image of the lamp and the mirror, and ask yourself which you are tending. When the manuscript keeps returning to that image, the lamp and the mirror, it is asking less for prophecy than for perception. So let us follow the text's next move. It turns from diagnosis to anatomy. Who exactly is the figure that walks in the light and casts no shadow? How does such a presence enter institutions, prayers, and neighborhoods without cordons being raised? The manuscript's answer, according to those who have translated its lines, is insistently social rather than supernatural. The figure advances not by spectacle alone, but by the careful rearrangement of incentives, attention, and language. It is a slow architecture of persuasion. Consider the mechanics the folio sketches. First comes reliability of tone, a steady voice that never seems to waver, that speaks calm while the world noises are loud. Then come the technologies of repetition, platforms, feeds, broadcasts, that make certain slogans feel inevitable. Next, there is the building of networks, allies in business, charity, worship, and the arts, who lend credibility by association. Finally, there is the soft management of consequence. Dissent is not smashed but marginalized. Critics are framed as cranky or archaic, and policies are gradually normalized until asking obvious questions becomes strange. In that sequence, applause functions not as consent, but as a tool.
The manuscript's phrasing about a lock closing during ovation is an allegory of consent shaped by convenience. It warns that power can entrench itself with the public's goodwill long before anyone notices that fences have been rearranged. That rearrangement is subtle because it often speaks in familiar languages: efficiency, unity, security, compassion. A leader who amasses trust can wear benevolent rhetoric while subtly reshaping rules. The manuscript's image of a person who leaves no shadow suggests someone whose public persona conceals any trace of accountability. No exposed past, no transparent finances, no record of contradictory promises. Someone who seems entirely constructed for present consumption.
Translators note the irony in calling such a person luminous, as if brightness itself can hide void. Some analysts reading the folio compare this to historical moments when popular figures appeared to solve immediate crises and in the process reduced the capacity of institutions to check them. The pattern is familiar: emergency powers, simplified narratives, the erosion of deliberative spaces. The manuscript does not accuse a single entity. Instead, it traces a social logic that could play out in many places if civic muscles go unused. Religion in the alleged text is not exempt from this dynamic. The manuscript speaks of pulpits that echo applause, of ministers and teachers who begin to prioritize cohesion and comfort over careful moral inquiry. It does not indict faith as such. Rather, it warns that faith communities can be co-opted when they mistake popularity for pastoral fidelity. The danger is theological flattening. Doctrines and disciplines that once sharpened conscience become glosses that soothe anxiety. The text portrays a scene in which spiritual language is repurposed to justify expediency, and where clear moral demands are softened into slogans that serve the leader's image. Again, the manuscript offers parallels rather than literal identifications, echoes of prophetic warnings found in many traditions about leaders who speak truth without cost and the congregations that follow. This is crucially where the social and spiritual threads entwine. When institutions, state, market, media, and sanctuary alike begin to trade complexity for simplicity, the conditions for a leader who walks in light are created. The manuscript's rhetorical genius here is to show how human craving for certainty becomes a structural vulnerability. We do not always give away our rights in dramatic sweeps. We exchange them in tiny bargains: convenience for oversight, unity for dissent, comfort for the discomfort of accountability. Those bargains, repeated and rationalized, accrete into systems that resist correction. So where do the silent watchers come in? The folio elevates them precisely because they interrupt that accretion. The watchers are not conspirators. They are keepers of ordinary institutions that, if left unattended, decay.
A silent watcher might be the municipal clerk who insists on recording votes in a ledger, the teacher who keeps an archived copy of local bylaws, the small newspaper that refuses glossy sponsors for the sake of editorial independence, or the community garden steward who tracks seed varieties with handwritten labels. These acts are unglamorous. They do not trend. They do not generate viral applause. Yet they generate a different kind of currency: verifiability. The manuscript's praise of verifiability is one of its more pointed injunctions. Where spectacle creates consensus through repetition, verifiability creates consensus through cross-checking and preservation. Silent watchers in this framing are people who build redundancies, not stockpiles or bunkers, but layers of recorded truth, transcripts, physical archives, oral histories, and practices that valorize transparency more than charisma. The folio's imagery of lamps being trimmed in corners is not a call to isolationism, it is a call to institutional hygiene. It asks whether communities will prioritize practices that make claims testable and leaders accountable. What does that look like in concrete social texture? The manuscript's pages offer scenes rather than directives. In one scene, a neighborhood press club organizes regular public readouts of city council minutes so that words uttered in a chamber cannot be later washed into myth. In another, a cluster of congregations commit to shared audit practices for charitable funds, not as a vote of distrust, but as a guardrail for generosity. Elsewhere, citizens insist that critical infrastructure designs be open to peer review, not hoarded behind proprietary walls. None of these images prescribes policy precisely. They are sketches of habit. The implied lesson is moral. Fidelity in small practices compounds into resilience in larger systems. All of which brings us to the mirror shock itself. If the manuscript sets 2026 as a hinge, the mirror shock is that hinge in emotional form, a public, private, or ecological rupture that forces people to confront what they have been tolerating. The text, careful in its language, suggests several archetypes of mirror events without attaching them to particular cities or tragedies. One possibility is an information failure. A widely trusted platform collapses or is exposed as manipulative, and suddenly millions discover they have shared a single narrative engineered for attention rather than accuracy. Another possibility is an environmental disclosure. A chain of failures during an extreme season reveals how many systems relied on fragile efficiencies. A third possibility is institutional exposure. Audits, leaks, or investigations make clear that decision-making had been concentrated in a few hands for too long. What is decisive in the manuscript's account is not which mirror breaks, but what people do when it does.
Will the shock generate a frenzy of scapegoating and the search for quick saviors, or will it stimulate a sober inquiry into institutional design and communal habits? The folio's voice favors the latter. It imagines communities that, in the aftermath, choose transparency over revenge, humility over grandstanding. It imagines an ethic of repair of systems, repair of relationships, repair of practices that sustain public life. The manuscript is not naive about the ease of such choices. It acknowledges that mirror shocks are terrifying precisely because they rearrange meaning. People want restoration immediately. They want clear villains and simple remedies. That desire opens the door for the very figures the folio warns about. A leader who preys on fear can appear as the quickest path back to normalcy. The alleged text's recurring question, will you choose comfort or conscience, is most potent at such moments. It calls citizens to resist the easy story, to examine incentives, and to insist on structures that distribute power rather than concentrate it. There is, in the alleged pages, a posture toward renewal that is modest and communal, rather than heroic and spectacular. The manuscript does not foresee an instant reversal. It foresees slow mending. The silent watchers, small archivists, local teachers, and congregations of inquiry become seeds for a different polity. They practice redundancy not out of paranoia, but out of prudence. They revalue slow deliberation in an era that prizes instant verdicts. The folio's rhetoric is almost countercultural. While the world runs on attention, the watchers store evidence. While the world celebrates winners, they preserve questions. Over time, these practices can change incentives. If verification becomes prized, spectacle loses its leverage. If accountability becomes routine, charismatic voids find it harder to expand. This is where the manuscript's moral imagination widens. It invites a narrative in which hope emerges not as rescue, but as cultivation. After mirror shock, a community might rebuild by strengthening its local ecosystems, networks of exchange, shared knowledge, mutual aid, not as alternatives to national institutions, but as complements. The manuscript praises such plural resilience. It does not promise tidy outcomes. It promises that a culture that learns to value truth-tending will have options when systems strain. Of course, skeptics will ask whether moral habits can withstand concentrated economic or technological power. The alleged text acknowledges this tension implicitly. It does not romanticize the remnant into a band of omnipotent fixers. Instead, it suggests a political and cultural strategy: multiply points of verification and widen the circle of responsibility. The watchers do not act alone. They cultivate allies, even within institutions, who share a preference for transparency. Over time, these allies can change norms, making it harder for charm to substitute for substance.
As the folio winds towards its final intimations, its tone softens in a way that is striking. After pages of warning, the manuscript ends with images of repair that are almost domestic. Neighbors sharing seeds, a librarian teaching children how to preserve family letters, a congregation debating public ethics in small groups, a local journalist refusing to exchange truth for access. These images are not cinematic in the sense of spectacle, they are cinematic in the moral sense. They show ordinary acts that in the aggregate shift the axis of a community. The text's closing paragraphs are careful to avoid triumphalism. It does not promise that all will be well. It offers, rather, a conditional hope. If communities choose scrutiny over spectacle, humility over hubris, and repair over resentment, then the year that could have been a hinge for collapse may instead become a hinge for correction. That conditionality is the manuscript's ethical core. It refuses determinism. It insists on agency. The year 2026 functions less as a prediction and more as a calendar for decisions. How might those decisions look in the weeks and months leading up to such a hinge? The manuscript again resists doctrinal prescriptions and instead recommends habits. Preserve records, encourage deliberation, train leaders to accept scrutiny, diversify information sources, and cultivate local redundancies that are social, not militarized. These are practices that anyone who cares about public life can take up without violating law or civic norms. They are acts of stewardship more than strategies of survival. The folio's moral imagination transforms preparedness into a civic virtue rather than a private bunker. There remains the question of fear, how to receive this alleged warning without being paralyzed by it. The manuscript seems to anticipate this paralysis and offers a remedy, companionate action. Fear, the text implies, is most destructive when it isolates. Courage, in its place, is social and practical. Neighbors talking, institutions opening windows of transparency, congregations recommitting to the hard work of discernment. The manuscript's images of the lamp and the mirror become, in this way, metaphors for two forms of community life, one lit by spectacle, the other tended by steady care. Which will you inhabit? That question completes the folio's arc from alarm to invitation. It does not turn dread into naive optimism. It asks for attention and then for choice. The final pages tie the ethical to the existential. The manner in which we live with information, with leaders, and with nature reveals the kind of society we are attempting to sustain.
The manuscript closes not with a curtain, but with an open door, a call to practice, to conversation, and to the slow cultivation of institutions that can withstand shocks.
As we step back from the alleged folio, and from the debates it has ignited, several practical reflections follow. Reflections that the manuscript itself seems designed to provoke. First, pay attention to where your trust is placed and why. Second, insist on public practices that make claims testable. Third, value the kinds of small, often invisible work that preserve truth. Fourth, resist the urge to treat any singular leader as an unchallengeable source of wisdom. These are not commands issued in a panic. They are prompts to civic maturity. If the folio is a fiction, its circulation nonetheless accomplishes something. It reorients attention toward habits that strengthen societies. If it is authentic, its warnings deserve the sober consideration the manuscript itself requests. Either way, the crucial point is that the pages push us toward a public ethic of truth-tending, an ethic that refuses the comfort of unexamined applause and prefers the inconvenience of shared responsibility. The alleged manuscript's final image lingers, a dim room in which one person trims a lamp as crowds cheer outside. What would it mean to be that person? To keep a lamp trimmed is to maintain an interior discipline, the habit of questioning, the discipline of record-keeping, the practice of resisting quick certainties. To be the person who gathers others to the lamp is to exercise leadership in the quiet, less glamorous sense of stewardship. The text implies that such people are not marginal relics, but the bedrock of any society that desires freedom and truth. In closing, remember that the manuscript frames 2026 as a moment of choice, not as an inevitability. The year is a summons to refocus attention on the fragile machinery of public life, our information systems, our civic procedures, our spiritual communities, and our environmental stewardship. The alleged pages ask us to decide whether we will cultivate lamps or adore the glare of luminaries who leave no shadow. That decision matters, and it is made in the small, everyday acts of civic life. If this discussion has made you reflect, if you find yourself wondering how you would answer the manuscript's questions about the lamp in the mirror, share this video with someone who cares about the future of our communities. Tell us in the comments, what small practices would you prioritize if you treated 2026 as a moral hinge? That conversation matters, because the manuscript's power, whether symbolic or historical, lies in how it moves people to think, talk, and act with prudence and courage rather than with panic.